She was born in Mexico to a Dutch father and a German mother. Raised across continents, speaking multiple languages and never entirely belonging to any one place. By the time she arrived in Hollywood, she was already something unusual, someone shaped by movement rather than stability. The world would come to know her as Linda Christian, but even at the height of her fame, the question of where she truly belonged was never fully answered. She had not been born into the kind of life that would normally lead to international attention. On November 13th, 1923, she entered the world as Blanca Rosa Welter in the oil town of Tampico, Mexico. It was a place defined less by culture or permanence and more by movement. A city shaped by industry, foreign workers, and the constant arrival and departure of people who rarely intended to stay. Her father, a Dutch executive working in the oil business, and her German mother created a household that was, from the beginning, difficult to place within any single identity. She was not fully Mexican in the traditional sense, not European in the way people expected, and not yet connected to the American world she would later try to enter. What she experienced instead was something far less stable, but in many ways far more formative. Childhood did not unfold in one country. It moved. South Africa, Palestine, Switzerland. By the time she reached her teenage years, she had already lived across multiple continents, absorbing languages, cultures, and ways of seeing the world that most people never encounter so early in life. She spoke Spanish, English, German, French, and Italian, not as academic skills, but as practical tools shaped by necessity and environment. It gave her an unusual kind of confidence, the ability to enter a room, understand it quickly, and adapt. But it also meant that there was no single place she could point to and say, without qualification, that it was home. That sense of movement, of belonging everywhere and nowhere at the same time, would follow her into adulthood in ways that were not immediately obvious, but would become increasingly important as her life began to take shape. By the early 1940s, she had made her way to Los Angeles. It was not an unusual destination for someone with ambition at that time, but the circumstances of her arrival were very different from those who typically succeeded there. She did not come with industry connections or the kind of financial backing that allowed for patience. What she brought instead was something less tangible, but in certain ways more effective. A belief that she could place herself into the right situations and be noticed. Hollywood, in that period, was still operating under the studio system. Careers were not built slowly or independently. They were decided, often quickly, by a small number of powerful figures who controlled access to opportunity. Getting in front of those people was not easy. Staying there was even harder. She began, as many did, on the margins. Small roles, uncredited appearances, Spanish language work where her background gave her an advantage. It was not the career she had imagined, but it was movement. And movement, for her, had always been enough to keep going. At some point during these early years, she managed to do what most aspiring actors never did. She got herself into a position where she could be seen by Louis B. Mayer, one of the most powerful men in the industry at the time. The details of that meeting have been told in different ways, but the outcome was clear. She made an impression strong enough to secure a contract with MGM. It was a turning point. Not because it immediately transformed her into a major star, it did not, but because it placed her inside the system, within reach of something larger than the small roles she had been taking. It was also during this period that she was given a new name, Linda Christian. It was a name designed to travel easily, to fit within the expectations of an international audience in a way her birth name did not. Names, in Hollywood, were rarely accidental. They were part of the construction, and for a time, It seemed as though that construction might lead somewhere significant. She appeared in a small number of films, including Holiday in Mexico and later Tarzan and the Mermaids. They were not defining roles, but they kept her visible. And visibility, in that system, was often the difference between being forgotten and being given another chance. What began to develop around her during these years was something slightly different from a conventional acting career. She was becoming known, not just within the industry, but in the broader sense, in photographs, in columns, in the kind of attention that existed just outside of film itself. It was a form of recognition that did not always translate into lasting roles, but it created something else entirely, a presence. And it was that presence, more than any single performance, that would lead to the next and most defining chapter of her life. She was becoming known, not just within the industry, but in the broader sense, in photographs, in columns, in the kind of attention that existed just outside of film itself. The turning point in her life did not arrive in the form of a role. It came instead as a person. Sometime in the mid-1940s, at a gathering in Hollywood that was not especially unusual for that world, she was introduced to Tyrone Power. At that time, he was already among the most recognizable faces in the industry. His films had reached audiences across continents, and his presence carried a kind of weight that few actors of his generation could match. He had recently returned from military service during the Second World War, and like many men of that period, there was a noticeable difference in him, a seriousness that had not been there before. Their meeting, by most accounts, was immediate in its effect. She was not easily overshadowed, even in rooms filled with people who were accustomed to being noticed. And he, despite the attention that surrounded him, was drawn to something in her that felt different from the world he already knew. What developed between them was not a casual association. It moved quickly, but not carelessly. There was a sense, at least in the beginning, that both of them understood what the other represented, not just personally, but publicly. For her, he was stability, recognition, and a connection to a level of fame that her own career had not yet fully reached. For him, she was something less defined, but no less compelling. Someone who moved through the world with ease, who did not seem intimidated by it, and who carried a kind of independence that was not always common in the circles he inhabited. By the late 1940s, their relationship had become serious. It was followed closely by the press, reported in columns that treated their appearances together as events in themselves. Photographs of the two of them began to circulate more frequently, and with them came a narrative that the public was quick to accept. They were seen, increasingly, as a pair. And in a world that understood stories best when they could be simplified, that was often enough. What followed was something larger than either of them could have fully anticipated. The wedding took place on January 27th, 1949, in Rome. It was not intended to become a spectacle, but it did. In the hours leading up to the ceremony, crowds began to gather outside the church. At first in small numbers, then in hundreds, and eventually in thousands. People climbed onto walls, leaned over railings, pressed against barriers set up by the police, all trying to catch a glimpse of the couple as they arrived. Rome, still emerging from the years of war, had seen its share of public events. But this was something different. It was not political. It was not official. It was personal. And yet it had drawn a level of attention that suggested something larger. A moment where cinema, celebrity, and public fascination had briefly merged into a single scene. Inside the church, the atmosphere was more controlled, but no less significant. The guest list included diplomats, filmmakers, members of European high society, and figures whose presence alone reflected the world the two of them now occupied. She wore a gown designed by the Fontana sisters, one of the most prominent names in Italian fashion at the time. It was elegant, carefully constructed, and photographed from every possible angle. The images travelled quickly. Within days, they appeared in newspapers across Europe and the United States. The wedding was no longer just an event. It had become a symbol of glamour, of post-war optimism, of a world beginning to look outward again. For Linda Christian, it marked the height of her visibility. At 25, she had become one of the most talked-about women in the world. It was, in many ways, the moment everything seemed to come together. The career, the attention, the marriage to a man whose name carried global recognition. From the outside, it appeared complete. What it did not reveal was how difficult it would be to sustain. In the years that followed, their life moved largely away from Hollywood and into Europe. Rome, in particular, became a kind of center point, a city where old aristocratic traditions, international film culture, and post-war wealth existed side by side. It was a place where someone like Linda Christian could move comfortably, where her background, her languages, and her social ease all found a natural setting. For a time, it worked. She adapted quickly, building connections within European high society, attending gatherings that extended far beyond the film world. She was no longer only an actress. She had become a presence within a much broader social landscape. During these years, she and Tyrone Power began a family. Their first daughter, Romina, was born in 1951, followed by Taryn in 1953. From the outside, it appeared that the life they had constructed was settling into something stable. But stability, in their case, was never as solid as it seemed. Power's career continued to demand movement, film commitments, travel, long periods away from home, the kind of schedule that placed distance into the structure of the marriage itself. There were also, by many accounts, other complications. His earlier marriage had already suggested that long-term constancy was not something he found easy, and during these years, reports began to circulate, first quietly, then more openly, of relationships that existed outside the one he had built with Linda. She was not unaware of it, and she was not, by temperament, someone who responded to difficulty by withdrawing. What developed between them was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual shift. Tension building over time, disagreements that became harder to contain, and a growing distance that could not be resolved simply by proximity. By the mid-1950s, what had once been private had become, in certain circles, understood. The marriage was under strain. In 1956, it came to an end. The divorce was finalized, and Linda retained custody of their daughters. It was not the dramatic conclusion that the scale of their wedding might have suggested. There was no single moment that defined it. Instead, it ended the way many things do, gradually, and then all at once. What remained afterward was something less visible, but no less significant. She was no longer part of the narrative that had once defined her public identity, and the question of what came next was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. What followed her divorce was not a retreat from the world she had been living in. If anything, it drew her deeper into it. By the late 1950s, she had re-established herself within the social circuits of Europe, Rome, Paris, the south of France, places where wealth, influence, and attention moved in overlapping circles, and where reputations were often built as much on presence as on achievement. It was within that world that she encountered Porfirio Rubirosa. He was, at that time, a figure who existed almost as a story in himself, a diplomat by title, a polo player by passion, and a man whose name appeared frequently in the company of some of the wealthiest women in the world. His life moved quickly, defined by speed, charm, and a kind of confidence that suggested consequences were something to be considered later, if at all. For someone like Linda, who had already lived through the structure of a highly visible marriage, the contrast was immediate. He was not stability, he was movement. Their relationship, from the beginning, carried that difference within it. They were seen together across Europe, at parties, at racing events, in the kinds of settings where attention followed them naturally. The press took notice, and their appearances began to form a narrative of their own, one that blended glamour with a certain underlying unpredictability. But beneath that surface, there was a different reality. Rubirosa's life was not constructed in the way a film career was. There was no studio, no structure, no long-term trajectory guiding it. It relied instead on access, on relationships, on the ability to remain in motion without ever fully settling. That kind of life can be compelling. It can also be unstable. Those who knew him understood that balance well. And over time, it became clear that the relationship between the two of them reflected that same tension. It was intense, at times exciting, and at other times difficult in ways that were not always visible from the outside. There were disagreements, periods of separation, and returns that seemed to repeat a pattern rather than resolve it. In 1959, she was involved in a serious car accident in Rome. The details were never fully clarified in public, but the timing and the accounts that emerged later suggested that it came during a particularly strained period in her personal life. The recovery was not only physical, and whatever had held the relationship together did not remain intact afterward. They separated, not with a clear conclusion, but in the way certain relationships end, gradually losing their center until there is nothing left to return to. Years later, in 1965, Rubirosa would die in a car crash in Paris, his life ending in a way that, to many who had observed it, seemed almost inevitable. By then, Linda had already moved forward, but the period she had spent with him marked something distinct in her life. A shift away from the idea of stability and toward a world that was far less predictable and far more difficult to control. There was another relationship during this period that, while less widely remembered, was no less significant in shaping the direction of her life. His name was Edmund Purdom. He had, for a brief time in the mid-1950s, occupied a position in Hollywood that suggested something larger might follow. He had stepped into roles under unusual circumstances, appeared in major productions, and seemed, at least momentarily, on the edge of a sustained career. But that momentum had not held. By the time their paths crossed, his career had shifted largely to Europe, into films that kept him working, but did not carry the same weight or recognition. In that sense, there was a similarity between them. Both had been close to something more stable within the industry. Both had, in different ways, found themselves moving through a world where visibility did not always translate into permanence. Their relationship developed within that shared understanding. They were seen together frequently in Rome and in the broader European social circuit, appearing at events, moving within the same familiar spaces that had defined much of her life since the early 1950s. For a time, there was a sense of ease to it. It was a connection between two people who did not need to explain the nature of the lives they were living. But ease, as it had before, did not last. Purdom's personal life was complicated, and his reputation among those who knew him suggested a certain inconsistency, a difficulty in maintaining stability over time. When combined with Linda's own circumstances, the result was not balance, but friction. The relationship became increasingly strained. There were disagreements, moments that extended beyond private tension and into something more difficult to manage. One incident, reported in the Italian press at the time and later referenced by those familiar with her life, suggested that the conflict between them had, at one point, become physically harmful toward her. The details were never fully established in public, but the existence of the report and the context surrounding it pointed to a relationship that had moved beyond simple incompatibility. Whatever remained between them did not survive it. The relationship ended, as others had, without resolution. What it left behind was not a single defining moment, but a continuation of something that had already begun to take shape in her life. A pattern of intensity, followed by instability, followed by loss. By the early 1960s, that pattern was becoming harder to ignore. She was still present, still visible, still moving through the same circles that had once defined her at the height of her fame. But the structure that might have held those pieces together, professionally, personally, was no longer there in the same way. And it was at this point, within that uncertainty, that she encountered someone very different from the men who had come before. The man she encountered next came from a very different world. His name was Pierluigi Aldobrandini. He was not a film star, and he did not belong to the kind of restless, highly visible life that had defined many of the people she had known in the years before. He came instead from one of the oldest aristocratic families in Italy, a lineage that extended back centuries, tied to a history that existed long before cinema and would continue long after it. In a city like Rome, that distinction still carried weight. By the time they met, Linda had already spent years moving through that world. She understood its customs, its expectations, and the quiet rules that shaped it beneath the surface. But this was different. This was not simply access. It was proximity. Their relationship, from the beginning, had a different quality to it. It was less chaotic, less defined by movement. And for a time, it seemed to offer something she had not experienced in years, a sense of stability. Those who observed them during this period often described a noticeable shift in her. There was a calmness to her presence, a sense that the constant motion that had defined much of her life had at least temporarily slowed. Rome, by then, was not just a place she visited. It was home. She knew its rhythms, its streets, the people who inhabited its social world. And within that setting, the relationship appeared, for a time, to fit. But it also carried a different kind of weight. Aristocratic families, particularly those with histories as long as his, were not entirely modern in their expectations. There were traditions, obligations, and boundaries that existed independently of individual desire. And Linda, despite everything she had become, remained in certain ways an outsider to that structure. The exact nature of what unfolded between them has never been fully documented in public detail. What is known is that the relationship did not resolve itself in a conventional way. By the late 1960s, it had come to an end. And then, in 1968, something happened that placed that ending into an entirely different context. Aldobrandini died in a skiing accident in the Alps. He was young. The death was sudden, unexpected, and final in the way accidents always are, offering no preparation, no gradual transition, only the immediate absence of someone who had been present. For Linda, the effect was profound. Those who knew her at the time described a grief that was not performative, not shaped for public consumption, but deeply personal and sustained. It was different from the endings that had come before. There was no conflict to resolve, no gradual separation that allowed for distance. There was simply loss, and with it, the quiet realization that certain chapters do not close in a way that can be understood or managed. By this point, she was in her mid-40s. She had moved through fame, through marriage, through instability, and now through a loss that could not be reframed into anything else. The world around her was changing as well. The Rome of the 1950s, the world of crowded cafes, photographers, and endless attention, was beginning to fade. The people who had defined it were moving on, aging, or disappearing altogether. What remained was quieter. and for the first time in many years, so was she. The years that followed did not unfold in the same way as those that had come before. There was no immediate replacement for what had been lost, no sudden return to the intensity that had once defined her life. Instead, there was a gradual shift, not outwardly dramatic, but significant nonetheless. Linda Christian remained in Rome for a time, still connected to the circles she had moved through for nearly 2 decades. The city itself was changing, and with it, the nature of the world she had once inhabited. The era that had made her visible, the post-war years of attention, glamour, and constant movement, was no longer what it had been. The people had changed. The energy had shifted, and the space she occupied within it was no longer defined in the same way. She did not disappear. She continued to appear occasionally in films and television productions, primarily in Europe, taking roles that kept her working but did not attempt to recreate what had already passed. It was not a retreat. It was an adjustment. What became more central during these years was not her public image, but her private life, particularly her role as a mother. Her daughters were growing, building their own identities within a world that was both familiar and complicated. They carried their father's name, a legacy that remained recognizable long after his death, and they were shaped, in different ways, by the life they had inherited. For Linda, this period brought a different kind of focus. The movement that had once defined her life did not disappear, but it slowed. The need to be present in every room, at every gathering, to remain visible in the way she once had, began to lose its urgency. What replaced it was quieter, but more stable. There were still connections, still friendships, still a place within the social world she had known for so long, but they no longer carried the same weight. Over time, her life began to shift geographically as well. The connection to the United States, which had once been tied primarily to her career, became more consistent again. She spent increasing amounts of time there, moving between continents in a way that echoed her earlier life, but with a different purpose. By the 1970s, the structure of her life had changed in a way that was not immediately visible from the outside, but was deeply felt by those close to her. The intensity had softened. The pace had slowed, and what remained was something more deliberate, a life no longer defined by constant motion, but by choice. As the years moved forward, the center of her life shifted more clearly away from public attention and towards something far more personal. Linda Christian continued to divide her time between Europe and the United States, but the urgency that had once defined her movements was no longer there. The world she had once been at the center of, the parties, the constant attention, the expectation of visibility, had changed, and she no longer needed to keep pace with it. What mattered now was different. Her daughters had grown into lives of their own. Tyrone Power, in particular, had become a major public figure in Europe, building a successful career as both a singer and an actress. Her work, especially in partnership with her husband, placed her at the center of a new kind of visibility, one that belonged to a different generation, but unfolded in many of the same places Linda had once known so well. There was something quietly significant in that. The same city, the same cultural world, but a different story. And this time, Linda was not at the center of it. She was watching it, supporting it, taking pride in it. Her relationship with her daughters became one of the most stable and consistent parts of her life. Those who knew them described a closeness that was not performative, not shaped by public expectation, but grounded in shared experience, in everything they had lived through together. During these years, she also began to reflect more directly on her own life. In the 1980s, she worked on her memoir, a project that would eventually be published under the title Linda, My Own Story. The book did not attempt to dramatize her past beyond recognition, nor did it fully expose every detail. Instead, it presented something more measured, a version of events told on her own terms, shaped by what she chose to include and what she chose to leave unsaid. That balance was characteristic of her. She had lived much of her life in public, but she had never entirely belonged to the version of her story that others told. Writing it herself was, in a quiet way, a form of reclaiming it. By this stage, she had begun to spend more consistent time in the United States, eventually settling in California. The shift was not abrupt. It was gradual, much like the rest of this phase of her life. What it represented was not a return to the past, but a movement towards something calmer, a life no longer shaped by the demands of visibility, but by familiarity, routine, and the presence of people who knew her beyond the image she had once carried. The intensity had passed. What remained was something quieter, but no less complete. In the final years of her life, the world that had once surrounded her existed mostly in memory. Linda Christian was living in California, far from the Rome that had once defined so much of her identity, and even further from the version of herself that had stood at the center of global attention decades earlier. The pace of her life had slowed considerably. The movement, the constant visibility, the sense of always being in the middle of something, had given way to something quieter, more contained, more private. She remained, by all accounts, mentally sharp. Those who spoke with her during these years often noted the same qualities that had defined her much earlier: a directness in the way she saw things, and a lack of sentimentality about her own past. She did not attempt to turn her life into something simpler than it had been. She understood it for what it was. On July 22nd, 2011, she died in Palm Springs at the age of 87. The cause was reported as heart failure. It was not a sudden ending. It came after years that had gradually drawn her away from the world that had once known her so well. In the days that followed, the story that appeared in many obituaries was a familiar one. The wedding, the marriage to Tyrone Power, the photographs that had once traveled across the world. It was, in a way, the version of her life that had always been easiest to tell. But it was not the whole of it. What those summaries often missed was everything that had come after. The movement across continents, the ability to build a life without a fixed place, the years spent navigating a world that was not designed to hold someone like her easily, the relationships that had brought both intensity and difficulty, the losses that had no simple resolution, and the decision, over time, to step away from the need to be defined by any of it. She had started with very little, no clear path, no established position, no certainty about where she belonged, and she had moved through some of the most visible spaces of the 20th century on her own terms, not perfectly, not without cost, but completely. In the end, her life was not defined by a single moment, not by a wedding, not by a name, not by a headline. It was defined by the fact that she continued. Through change, through difficulty, through the long years when attention had moved elsewhere. She continued, and when it was over, she left behind something more complex than the version most people remembered. A life that did not fit easily into a single narrative, and did not need to.